The progressive movement began to become a national movement by the early 1900s. And what was happening is what started off as a grassroots movement, very important term, grassroots. It's coming from below the average people, starts to take on more of a national tone. And that really kind of happens with the election of progressive leaders. You know, in the beginning, it was just these ordinary people who were struggling for reform, who were advocating for reform. And you start getting people, politicians, who kind of take on this label of progressivism. Something dramatic happens in September of 1901. There is an assassination. And this assassination of the president, William McKinley, by an anarchist in September 1901, really shocks the nation, and it catapults an individual into the presidency who at the time will be the youngest ever to hold that office. At age 42, Theodore Roosevelt will become president. And suddenly now you have this very dynamic leader in the White House, 42 years old, and he's going to dramatically increase the power of the presidency. He is going to be a progressive era leader. He was an interesting fellow. He fought in the Spanish-American War. He was an outdoorsman. He was kind of, a wild card in many ways. He was governor of New York, and now he's the president of the United States. And there's this idea that some people worried that damn cowboy is in the White House. He was an outdoorsman. He lived out in the West for a while. He was, during the Spanish-American War, a member of the Rough Riders. And so now he's the president of the United States. And there's a famous quote I like of Theodore Roosevelt. It's not really a quote, famous quote, but someone said something about Roosevelt, that he loved to be the center of attention. And it goes, when Theodore Roosevelt attends a wedding, he wants to be the bride. And when he attends a funeral, he wants to be the corpse. This man loved to dominate a room. He loved to be the center of attention. And now he's the president. And he's going to take on a whole bunch of issues as president. He's going to be a very active president. Famously, there is the story of Theodore Roosevelt. He was a hunter. He was an outdoorsman. And he was hunting one time and refused to shoot a bear cub. And of course, living in a capitalist society, someone came along and kind of came up with this idea of a teddy bear. The nickname for Theodore being Teddy. And so Teddy Bear was born. Now in class, I will be sharing with you a dating tip, and it has to do with Build-A-Bear, going to Build-A-Bear, and telling the person in the store who you happen to maybe have a little crush on the story of Theodore Roosevelt. That actually right there is the first teddy bear that was marketed, named after Theodore Roosevelt. So Roosevelt's going to be one of these progressive era presidents, takes office in 1901, transforms the office of the presidency. And really, one of the areas that he's going to make a name for himself as a progressive is going to be with these monopolies. Remember, the monopolies, the trusts were left to kind of do as they please. There was this laissez-faire approach. And Roosevelt looks at all these businesses coming together. Come together right now over me. And Roosevelt's going to see all these different businesses come together, and he's going to call for what is known as trust busting. He states in his one of his first speeches as president that he wants all Americans to have a square deal. And he's looking at all these mergers, and you can see there's areas of, peaks of corporate mergers, monopolies forming, and he's worried about these things because they're destroying competition. There is no competition, or competition is being reduced to a point where consumers are being hurt with high prices and corrupt business practices. And he basically makes a goal of getting it on with these monopolies. Let's get it on. Let's get it on. Hey, hey. In In fact, he uses a law that was in existence way before he even became president, the Sherman Antitrust Act. Sherman Antitrust Act was passed in 1890, and this law basically made it illegal to have monopolies. But for the first 10, 11 years of the Sherman Antitrust Act's history, it wasn't really used to break up monopolies. In fact, it was actually used against workers and preventing them from being able to strike. So Roosevelt's looking at this situation of, this very famous big business practices of people like Rockefeller and Carnegie and so on and so forth, and he's going to take them on. He's going to take on these big monopolists, and he is going to hold them accountable. And in so doing, it's this kind of increase of regulation. Regulators, mount up. And there's all these great images of Roosevelt kind of taking on the bad trust. He's not against business. He's not, against business or, anti-capitalist, but he is against special treatment for capitalists. And he wants these corporations to serve the public good. So here you see him, he's killing the bad trust, and he's regulating the good trust. He's restraining them. And he's doing this by using the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up those that are violating the public good. Regulators, mount up. So you have all this stuff happening, and Roosevelt, gets this reputation for being a trust buster. In fact, during this period alone, 43 antitrust cases are going to go pursued by the government. In fact, they're going to break up the big powerful one, Standard Oil. So you have this kind of attention to serving the public good, the square deal, and once again, here's Roosevelt wielding the sword in the name of public service, taking on these monopolies. So all this stuff's being done. There's a video that I'll show you perhaps in class. And in 1904, he easily wins re-election. He gets 50% of the popular vote. He was enormously popular, Theodore Roosevelt, and continues to use government power to regulate business. Two acts that are passed. 1906, you have the Hepburn Act. Hepburn Act, you don't need know a whole lot about it, except that it's going to impose regulations on railroads. It sets maximum rates that they could charge, and basically gives more power to the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC. So the Interstate Commerce Commission is regulating railroad rates. Hepburn Act gives the government more power to regulate. Actually, a couple years before that, regulators, mount up. You have the Atkins Act, which was passed, which increased the penalties that businesses, especially railroad companies, would have to pay for giving rebates to customers' favoritism. So you have these two laws, the Atkins Act, the Hepburn Act, and the big idea here is this. Regulators, mount up. And so you have this dramatic increase in government power, government regulatory power. And Roosevelt's using the highest office within the federal government, the presidency, to do this. And so this is a big change. Up until Roosevelt, there was no leader in the White House that was pursuing these reforms. Now, one area that Roosevelt is going to, his attention is going to be brought to has to do with the nation's food. And what was going on with the nation's food was basically it was completely unregulated. And so this is, for those of you that were in class, you saw my whole little, spiel on this whole, imagine for a moment your lunch, your cafeteria food, that delicious treat that you wait for while sitting in class, third and fourth period. Imagine for a moment someone told you the meat was not properly refrigerated, the worker did not use gloves when handling the meat, the fries were made from expired potatoes, the apple was injected with chemicals to make it last longer, and rats and roaches freely crawled on the food while it sat in storage. Would you believe it? Maybe you would. Maybe you would say that's why it has that funny taste. But the question was, do you know what you are eating, and who protects your food? And one of the things that happens during this time period is there was this lack of public attention to the nation's food supply. In fact, today we have all sorts of kind of safeguards for the public. You go to a restaurant, the Department of Health and Services of Los Angeles has gone in there and given it a grade. And before, though, this period of time, when it came to protecting the food of the nation, there was no real safeguards in place. Here's a typical scene in a meatpacking plant. You can see the kind of, questionable conditions. There's no mask and gloves or hairnets or uniforms, and the pigs going into the machine and all this stuff. This is just a great picture for those of us that like bacon. Bacon. And a guy by the name of Upton Sinclair, once again, the grassroots. He's not in the government. In fact, he was a socialist. Upton Sinclair gets a job in a Chicago meatpacking plant, and he writes a book called The Jungle. We don't lumber in the jungle, the mighty jungle, the lion sleeps tonight. In the jungle, the quiet jungle, the lion sleeps tonight. The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. He writes his book, and I know what you're thinking. What was it about? Well, it's the story of immigrant workers in Chicago stockyards. And in the jungle, they focused on poverty, working conditions, and other workers' rights issues. And this kind of book, Upton Sinclair, his goal was not even anything to do with the meat industry particularly. It was to focus on the conditions of the workers, to focus on the horrible working conditions, the poverty of those workers, and to get the audience to support socialism. And this book comes out, and people read it, and it's quite famous. And what happens is, Upton Sinclair famously says, I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach. The American public was more outraged by the conditions of the meat than they were of the workers in the factories. In fact, there was a huge angry protest. How dare this? There's descriptions of rats crawling on the food, and the dry dung of rats had to be swept off, and sometimes in the hoppers that would grind up the meat, there would be animals like roaches and rats and rat poison, and the workers would spit on the floor where the meat was, and you could see right here, there was immediate reaction. How dare this be happening in America? Theodore Roosevelt is in office, and he does order an investigation when someone brings the book to his attention. There he is with his muck rake, and he's plugging his nose from the disgusting smell. And this scandal really provokes an outrage in this country, and in 1906, the Meat Inspection Act is passed. And the Meat Inspection Act was passed by the same year that the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed, which I talked about in a previous lecture. So these laws, these basic laws regulating not just monopolies, but food, medicine, child labor, and other issues are hugely important, and they don't always come from government. In fact, in this case, they're coming from a book written by a private citizen who wanted people to support workers' rights and socialism. And here you got a big contrast with the first picture I showed you. Here you got people, they're wearing uniforms, they got the hair cap, you got the government inspector going in there playing with the sausage, and you have this kind of change and let's clean up this situation. People actually died from eating bad meat prior to these laws, or taking bad drugs. Another example of the government inspector checking the conditions of the food supply in Chicago in 1919. Another part of this kind of progressive movement was a growing concern with how do we balance the needs of development with environmental concerns. How do we, have paper but also have trees? How do we produce steel but also have air that we can breathe? And a big part of the progressive movement or one aspect of it, was this growing concern that America was destroying its natural resources. Trees were being cut down. This is such a great picture. 1912, you have this giant tree. These grown men are dwarfed by the size of this tree. It was, centuries old, and trees and forests were being cleared away. Back in the early and late 19th century, the buffalo and other animals were being just wiped out. Here this man sitting on these buffalo hides, which were used to sell. So the story of the buffalo being slaughtered, also connected to the Native American genocide. You have hydraulic mining, where they're using high pressurized, water to clear away the land, looking for resources such as gold and silver. So hydraulic mining here in this image. It's altering the land in a way that is destructive to the native species. And of course, the factories, famously cities like Pittsburgh, certain days of the year you couldn't even really go outside without kind of inhaling this thick waste in the air from these plants. And you get people that start to pay attention to this. Roosevelt, in fact, says conservation is the most vital internal question facing the nation. It is the big deal. It is the thing that we need to face more than any other. And Roosevelt's the first guy ever in the presidency to make environmental issues a priority. We're used to presidents and people talking about, the environment and global warming and oil and energy and green energy and, save the polar bears and, all that stuff. But up until Theodore Roosevelt, there wasn't really anyone ever talking about it. It wasn't popular. It didn't get you votes. Now, he's talking about this destruction of the trees and the factories and the animal species and all this natural beauty being wasted away. But he's not the first. It's not like he, on his own came up with these ideas. And he is really influenced by his relationship with a very kind of profound individual named John Muir. We have a bunch of Muir middle schools all around Los Angeles. John Muir right here with the awesome beard. And here he is right here with Theodore Roosevelt. John Muir, there's Theodore, there they are again. John Muir is a preservationist who was advocating well before Roosevelt took office this idea of conservation. He created the Sierra Club back in 1892. And the idea behind the Sierra Club is let's advocate on behalf of the environment. And John Muir creates this organization to lobby the government and business and private individuals to preserve the environment. John Muir was the president. Him and Roosevelt back in 1903 went to Yosemite. Here they are. They camped out. John Muir advocated on behalf of the environment with Roosevelt and showed him some of the natural beauty. Roosevelt was an outdoorsman himself, so he appreciated nature in many ways. Now, there's two different kind of approaches, though, here. So make sure you know the definition of both. Both are trying to protect the environment, but it's a matter of strategy or how you look at nature. And you have on one end preservation and on the other conservation. John Muir is a preservationist, and there he is, thinking of the Lorax. And preservation, if you think of that word, to preserve, is to keep something exactly as it is. If I'm going to preserve something, I'm going to keep it the way it is. And John Muir is a preservationist. There was this idea that you needed to keep nature as it was. And John Muir felt that nature needed to be saved. And here's are some of his quotes, how he kind of viewed nature.
Climb the mountains and get their good tidings. Nature's peace will flow into you as sunshine flows into trees. The winds will blow their own freshness into you, and the storms their energy, while cares will drop off like autumn leaves.
There was this idea that nature was there to kind of take away your worries, as a place to relax, as a place to just kind of get away from the hustle and bustle of urban areas.
That's hot.
In fact, here's another one. Everybody needs beauty as well as bread. Places to play in and pray in where nature may heal and cheer and give strength to the body and soul. Another one.
Smoking.
I like this one. God has cared for these trees. save them from drought, disease, avalanches, and 1,000 tempests and floods, but he cannot save them from fools. You know, this nature has been around for so long, and yet humankind has come around and is just destroying it without any regard for the future. So John Muir's a preservationist, and he's going to advocate for the environment, and he's going to pursue these ideas. And that is why on the back of our California quarter, John Muir is on the special edition. You know, him kind of hiking. There's tons of wilderness areas in California named after John Muir, national parks and state parks and whatnot. There's schools, there's stamps, and extra credit if you grow an awesome John Muir beard. But Roosevelt was not a preservationist. He actually is a conservationist. And this is kind of one of those like battle over terms, like what you call each other. They're both trying to save the environment. But conservation, Roosevelt appointed this guy to be the head of the U.S. Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot. And Gifford Pinchot was the head of the U.S. Forest Service, and basically his whole idea was conservation. And conservation is a little different than preservation. To conserve. We think about if you have water, what does it mean when you conserve it? Well, you're using it, but you're using it in a way that you can have it later on. So conservation is sustainable use, la da 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 da, and management of natural resources, including wildlife, water, air, and earth deposits. So you manage your use in a way that will allow you to have it for future generations. So sustainable use and management of your natural resources. So you set aside some forest for a national park, but you cut some trees down, but you replant them. That's conservation. So there were certain areas where John Muir and Theodore Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot disagreed. You know, Muir was against the building of dams because it destroyed the environment in the area. Dams, though, are necessary to produce electricity or to produce water for the surrounding area. So these two areas are not as clear-cut as we all love the environment. So you have preservation and conservation, and here's Roosevelt with Gifford Pinchot talking about these issues. And under Theodore Roosevelt, you're going to have a huge increase in the number of, or the amount of land set aside for these purposes. In fact, Theodore Roosevelt is going to set aside 200 million acres of public land as national forests, national parks, a huge amount, over 200 million acres of land. And on this map, you can actually see some of the areas in which was set aside. 53 wildlife reserves, 16 national monuments, 5 new national parks. So this is Roosevelt's legacy. In fact, these are some of the ones, the national parks, attributed to Theodore Roosevelt. Now, there were some national parks before, but he dramatically increases the amount of land protected. And, of course, there's some of the national parks. Those are not all Theodore Roosevelt's doing, but you could see, and if you've ever been to one of these national parks, you know what amazing places of beauty these are. Now, interestingly enough, Theodore Roosevelt, when he leaves the presidency, goes to Africa and was an avid hunter. So, you know, he's a complex fellow. Here he is with the big water buffalo in Africa. There he is with the big bull elephant. There he is riding horseback. So Roosevelt did believe in, you know, using the environment, including hunting, but doing so in a manageable, sustained way. So that ends this part of the lecture. Next lecture we'll deal with William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft right there with Theodore. So we'll learn about him. Until next time, study, eat your vitamins, and love each other.